no one from the US has come on.
No, that's a pity. But anyway, nonetheless, the visitors from the UK are extremely welcome. And it's good to see people from around the state of Victoria who don't usually have the opportunity of attending. So that's a great bonus for us all as well. Normally at a philatelic meeting such as this, in the event of Marjorie Crawford's sad death some 10 days ago, I'd be calling on us all to recognise that with a moment's silence. I don't think that's practical in this current environment, but what I would say to you is, for those that knew her, remember how stoic and humorous and hardworking she was, fully in the knowledge of where her condition was taking her. I think she was an extremely brave lady, and I think in these times of adversity, when we all turn around and are worried about our current life and lifestyle, just think of how she confronted the situation that she was, and I think our problems will seem all the smaller as a consequence. So with that little statement, there will be later in the year comments from me about Marjorie's contribution, and we will recognise the minute's silence as we would normally do at the first meeting when we get together face to face. Let it be said, I look forward to that day, and I only hope that it happens sooner rather than later, but the signs are pretty variable. But we'll talk about that later in today's proceedings. The role for me now then is to introduce you to our visiting speaker, Peter Allan, who's going to talk about Tasmania revenues, and the years that he is covering, which I've immediately lost, is 1863 to 1900. So Peter, thank you very much for being the person that christens our attempts at Zoom meetings. I'm sure we're very fortunate to have someone with your knowledge of computers and your knowledge of your subject to christen it. So Peter, over to you. Thank you very much for doing it, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, John, and hello everybody, and thank you for coming along to this meeting. I hope you find it of some interest. The first thing I need to do is just to share my screen, and then I'll be going through a PowerPoint presentation which I will speak to. Before we get to that point, I should just introduce what I'm going to show. I've been interested in Tasmanian revenues for 14 or 15 years, but I'm not really a great stamp collector. I've been collecting documents and trying to work out what they mean and interpret them and understand the rates and the purpose. Fairly recently, the Revenues Commission, the FIP Revenues Commission, have seen fit, and it's a very good move, to broaden the definition of revenue exhibits. They've introduced something called revenues history. And that was right up my alley, because really that's what I've been collecting. So what I'm going to show is my collection of Tasmanian revenue history. It was the subject of an exhibit. I entered it into Canberra. I didn't think it was fair or reasonable on anybody to go through 80 sheets. I think it would probably drive you crazy. So I've pulled the exhibit to bits. I've scanned it. I've tried to make it into a story and show the key items and some of the highlights. So without further ado, just give me, I reckon, 60 seconds and I'll make a start. Here we go. Okay, now I'm hoping everybody can see that first slide. Well, you're all muted, so assume that you
we can see it, it's fine.
Okay, that's all I need to know. Okay, so as I said, this is a study of revenue history. It's a bit like postal history. It's not really the same, because revenues are different animals. It's mainly about the documents and trying to understand them. So it talks about the rates and how the revenues were denoted, and how they were paid, and some of the reasons behind some of the rather strange and puzzling aspects of Tasmanian revenue history. So I did say that this starts in 1863, but in fact, Tasmania had the first revenue in Australia in 1827. So I will mention that before I move on to the mainstream revenues. It really boils down to a small number of acts which provided the authority for the revenues. 1863, there were actually two. The first one was a muck-up, and they had to recall Parliament and reenact an amended act. There was another act in 1870 and then a new one in 1882. There were, of course, plenty of amendments and some administrative proclamations. So as I said, the focus is the rates and the regulations as shown by the documents, and the way that duty was paid and why the different ways of paying duty were developed. So this is the first Australian revenue. It's a twopenny newspaper revenue, but its purpose was not really to raise revenue for the government. Its purpose was to suppress a newspaper. Governor George Arthur was the governor at the time, and he was a very autocratic gentleman. He was the subject of a lot of criticism. A guy called Savoury and a number of others ran the local Hobart newspaper, and to make their life difficult and in an attempt to shut them up, he basically charged a twopenny duty on every newspaper. These are not particularly uncommon. They're not common, but they are around. They're just a hand stamp, usually in red, and there is a very rare black one. This duty lasted for 2 years. It was abandoned. And then we move on to really the more serious aspects of Tasmanian revenues starting in 1863. Now, the background to this was the colony had cancelled or stopped transportation of convicts. That meant a huge reduction in cash flow from the UK, caused a financial crisis in the colony, and they turned to a number of methods of raising money for the much needed public works. And Tasmania copied, I think, the Straits Settlements, or Singapore, very much in their first act. But the idea of taxing various types of financial transactions and legal transactions wasn't new, but this was the first attempt in Australia. The first act was badly drafted. It started on the 1st of October. They promised the electorate that they wouldn't levy duty on cheques or on receipts or bills of lading, but through bad drafting, the Act actually did implement taxes on those items. So Parliament was recalled. 2 weeks later, they passed a new Act and away they went. They exempted the banks from paying duties, but the banks had to pay a fee to the government based on their notes in circulation. And 2 important issues here. The duties will be payable by duty stamps impressed on adhesive paper, which really means by sticking a stamp on a document, similar to the way you'd stick a postage stamp on a document. And they had to be cancelled by writing the day, the month and the year across the stamp. So the first documents we see have either got a duty stamp, a George and the Dragon stamp, or a Allan, the stamp, the current postage stamps of the period. Here we have 2 1-shilling Allans, the in Perth issue of 1858. And you'll see one of them has a date, the 30th of September 63. Now that is the earliest date that I've found. It's a day before the Act actually started, but the whole Act was published in the Hobart Gazette the week before, and I think somebody just jumped the gun because I think it is a genuine date. But these early dates are quite scarce, and if you like to collect these things, the very early dates are worth having. If you're a stamp collector, although stamp collectors look down their nose on pen cancelled stamps, but you will find many fine examples of Tasmanian stamps that have been pen cancelled, and just an example there of a block of 10 penny perforate Allans. Although the regulations didn't call for any metallic stamps, we do see 3 or 4 such things. The Colonial Treasury hand stamp is quite common, and you will see that. That was from the first batch of Tasmanian circular date stamps that were issued in 1865. And on the, you'll see the side faces there with a very late usage of that hand stamp. There is a very rare date stamp, and I don't know anything about it. It's Department of Education. We're only aware of 5 copies, and there's an example there on the bottom of that hand stamp. But these were above and beyond. The Act didn't require such date stamps to cancel the stamps. Pen cancel was sufficient. The other one that's quite common is the Supreme Court Associates Office, which actually isn't a date stamp. It's just a brass hand stamp, and the date was still endorsed in by hand. So let's have a look at some of the typical documents from the time. I think this is the earliest recorded date of a promissory note, which has paid 6pence duty. And I won't go into all the rates of duty, it would drive you crazy, but at the time, promissory notes between 25 and 50 pounds were subject to 6pence duty. Similarly, here's quite a high value promissory note to the tune of $400 with 4 shillings duty. Again, very, very early, it's 64, it's only a few months after the Act was introduced. This is quite an interesting one. It's actually a promise to pay a sailor £2 if he ever gets back from a whaling expedition. We don't know if he did or not, but I'd say it's technically a promissory note, and it's paid by a private perf, George and the Dragon. The government issued George and the Dragon stamps were imperforate at this time, but they were sold to 2 newsagents, one in Hobart, Walsh's, and one in Launceston. And so we see private perforations as well, not particularly uncommon. So let's move along. This is an early share transfer certificate. It was some time before we see specific duties on shares, but there was a catch-all provision in the Act, and it seems that court share certificates, even though they weren't specifically named, so it seems to me that it's a deed not of any kind, not otherwise charged, and the rate was a 2 and 6 flat rate. I should have said one of the challenges of this sort of collecting is to understand what you're looking at, and you're really talking about 19th century legal documents, half of which are called indentures, but an indenture simply means an agreement, so it could be all sorts of legal documents. You need to read it and understand what sort of agreement it is, and I don't claim to have a law degree from 1863, so sometimes I'm not quite sure, and you have to make a bit of a stab in the dark, but part of the fun is trying to work out what we're actually looking at when we see a document of this type. Here's one, it's called an indenture, and it's in relation to a bequest. As I said, it's simply, an indenture is simply an agreement, but I think, again, this is something under the Act that was named a deed, not otherwise charged. And you can see the George and the Dragon stamp gives you a pretty good idea of the accuracy of the local perforations at the time. So again, these sort of badly perfed stamps are not particularly uncommon. In 1865, surprise, surprise, the government decided they would go back on their word and they would introduce duty on cheques and receipts. So how often have we seen something like this happen when it comes to taxation? They introduced a penny duty on receipts and also cheques above 40 shillings. Importantly, though, they introduced the use of impressed duty stamps, by which I mean hand stamps rather than adhesive stamps, and that included both coloured hand stamps and also embossed stamps. So I've been spending a bit of time with Dingle and Dave Ellsmore. We're writing an article for the next Courier on these early embossed and impressed hand stamps. They're quite mysterious. Some of them are extremely scarce. So here are some examples of the what we're calling the impressed stamp, which is just a brass hand stamp pressed onto the paper. There were two of these, and the bottom right is extremely rare. We've only been able to find one copy and we don't know much about it. So if you're ever looking at early Tasmanian revenues and you see these things, they're worth keeping a lookout for. The embossed stamps were colourless, and that makes them quite sort of cryptic. And I'm sure collectors miss these because if you look at the check on the bottom, you can probably hardly see the embossed stamp. And it's difficult for me to show you a decent image. I've done my best. But again, there were two different dies, and both of them are quite scarce. And the second one on the check is actually really quite scarce. So just moving on, you could also pay your receipt at this time by using an adhesive postage stamp. And there we have an example with a penny shell and paying a receipt of just over £20. A few amendments came through. I won't dwell on these. They dropped the lower value on duty on cheques. It was 40 shillings before duty was paid, and in 1868 you had to pay duty on any cheque of a penny. They introduced a number of new duties, and I'll talk a bit more about the reasons why, but we're starting to see the state of Tasmania get very cash strapped and have all sorts of financial problems, and the revenue from duties became more and more important. In 69, duty on share transfers was introduced, and in 1870, a new act was proclaimed. The colony was now in quite serious debt. They'd had to borrow money from the UK on the UK money market, and they had to pay these borrowings back. A lot of rates were doubled to 5 shillings. New forms of duty were introduced. At this time, if you read the newspaper reports and look at the legislation, there was a major problem with forgery and reuse of duty stamps. And anybody that collects Tasmanian stamps will be aware of the so-called mint no gum issues, which are really pen cancelled stamps where the pen cancel's been washed off and they've been reused. It was so serious that the penalty for forging duty stamps was 10 years imprisonment, and any informer reporting evasion of duty could receive half the amount recovered, which is a very generous reward. So that gives you a fair idea of how serious the issue was. Now, at this point, it's as good a time as any to talk about the strange change of policy on a number of occasions regarding the use of duty stamps and the use of postage stamps. In 1863, the George and the Dragon duty adhesives were introduced, and that for rates not covered by postage stamps. You could use postage stamps, or you could use duty stamps to pay your stamp duty. The weird thing about that is how the accounting couldn't be undertaken in the post office or the colonial treasury, because if you were using postage stamps to pay duty, you just couldn't determine where that revenue went, back to the treasury or to the post office. So nobody's offered a good explanation as to why you could use both forms, but there we are. In 1870, there was the Act banned the use of duty stamps to pay duty. You could only use postage stamps. And they were so serious in 1870 that all the George and the Dragon stamps that were not issued were burnt. They were destroyed. Now, somebody asked me the other day, were people given notice this was going to happen? And I have no idea, but all I can say is you will not see a George and the Dragon duty stamp paying stamp duty between 1870 and 1880, or at least I've never seen one. So I think the stocks were burnt and people had warning and used whatever stocks that they had. You'll see the extensive use of the 5 shilling side face, because a lot of the duties were 5 shillings in value. And in May, there was another change of policy, in May 1880, that revenue stamps would be introduced again, and that revenue stamps and postage stamps would be strictly separate. And at this point, the new platypus design for low values was introduced. We see reprintings of the George and the Dragon series in different colours. And then in 1882, the Stamp Duty Act was further amended and postage and revenue stamps were made interchangeable. So again, within 2 years, the policy was changed. In 1900, of course, the use of postage stamps to pay state duty came to an end because of federation. The post office was a Commonwealth responsibility, and so you couldn't use Commonwealth-owned postage stamps to pay stamp duty. Now, the only real explanations for these changes in policy that I've been able to come up with are it's very much to do with personalities and who was the treasurer. Charles Meredith was the treasurer in 1863. He was a progressive. He liked taxation. He introduced the first Stamp Duty Act. But he and his wife, actually Louisa Ann Meredith, suggested the George and Dragon issues as a design for the first duty stamps. Now, Charles Meredith came out of government. His party, well, they didn't really have parties, but his group lost power. And when that happened, we see the banning of duty stamps altogether and just the use of postage stamps. And in 1878 or 79, Charles was again treasurer and back in government, and we see the reintroduction of duty stamps. So there were different views in the government about using duty stamps and postage stamps, and it just seems to be down to personalities and personal views rather than any particular logic. So let's have a look at a few documents from the 1870 Act. One of the features of this Act was the introduction of collectors of stamp duty. This was another measure to make sure people weren't avoiding paying duty. You could take your document to the Treasury in Hobart or Launceston, and you could pay your duty in cash, and a collector would simply sign on the document. Now, these endorsements are actually quite rare, but I don't believe they are genuinely rare. I just think because there aren't stamps on some of these that collectors haven't seen fit to keep them. But that's just my theory. Here's a typical document from the 1870 Act, and you'll see the use of a 5 shilling pen cancelled Tasmanian sideface. The interesting thing is I think Tasmania was the only state, as far as I'm aware, I might be wrong, but to use this eye rivet to affix the stamp to the document, and that was yet another means of making sure people didn't, remove the stamps and wash off the cancel and reuse them. Here's another document of the period. This is quite an interesting little document. It's a 13-year-old orphan was indentured to be a housekeeper for a family. And if you read the inside of the document, which you can't see, she was almost a slave. She had no ability to leave the house without permission. She had to work 7 days a week, do everything she was told, and would be punished for any misdemeanours. So just an interesting little bit of social history. In 1880, as I said, we have the first amendment of the 1870 Act, where we have a separation of postage stamps and duty stamps. And at this point, the new platypus design was introduced, which you'll see there. And again, that was the design of that stamp was the brainchild of Charles Meredith's wife, Louisa Ann. And she was involved in the design of the stamp and really pushed for the use of a platypus. The government would have liked to use the thylacine, but the Cascade Brewery had already used the thylacine, so they couldn't use that as the design for these new duty stamps. So in 1880, after 10 years, we see the introduction of a wide range of further embossed duty stamps, the platypus design. And I say after 10 years because the Act of 1870 foreshadowed these and did mandate that these embossed stamps be used on promissory notes and bills of exchange. But in typical Tasmanian government fashion, it took them 10 years to get the dies produced in England. They finally got onto it in 1877, but it took nearly 3 years for these the dies for these platypus embossed stamps, which I'll show in a minute, to become in use in Tasmania. There's quite a long and amusing saga around the stamp design, which I won't go into in detail, but when the drawings were sent to the Crown Agent in London, they formed a view that the drawings were inaccurate. So they went to the British Museum and they found a stuffed platypus. Unfortunately, the stuffed platypus was badly deformed. So their final designs for the stamp featured a very strange looking animal with extremely large feet and an oversized bill. When it hit the colony back in Tasmania, it was the subject of huge derision and a lot of colourful speeches in Parliament. But we stuck with these platypus designs and they were used right through well into the 20th century. So this is what we're talking about, and they're quite common. You probably would have seen them, especially if you collect anything Tasmanian. Initially, they were issued using a colourless dye machine. They ordered a new machine that could introduce colour, and within 2 years we start to see the coloured platypus dyes. Early in the piece they used date slugs, those 3 blank holes that you can see, the day, the month and the year, but the use of those fell out of favour within a few years as well. So here's an early colourless embossed platypus die, which I apologise for the image, but very hard to scan and see the die. This is just a promissory note. These are quite collectible, and if you're into this sort of thing, of course, you can do early and late dates using these notes to see if you can come up with the early date and the late date for each of the different values. So here's a typical coloured die. And that has got the date slugs. You're probably hard to read, but they're 1888. It's just paying a penny duty on a cheque. And here's a more interesting one. I think this is the largest value in my collection. How much is it? Yeah, £1,529, 18 shillings and 6pence. So it's big sum of money for those days. And some of these high value dies are actually really hard to find. So there's 10 shillings, but the values went up to £20 and they are really hard to find. In 1882, we have the last Stamp Act. They were called Stamp Acts, even though they were Stamp Duty Acts, of the 19th century, excluding some amendments. Now, we've seen the duties go up and up, but in the economic cycle of the late 1880s, Tasmania was actually doing really well. Mining was booming, we had a lot of growth, we had timber, agriculture, so the government was in less need of revenue, and they'd cut out a whole lot of duties at this point. And you won't see any receipts from 1882 through until 1902 with stamp duty. There was no need to pay duty based on this act. So here's a couple of typical documents. Again, it's called an indenture, but I think it's a bond and covenant, if I've got this right. But this is a fairly typical use, and we'll see the second issue of the George and the Dragon 2 and 6 penny duty stamp, paying the duty on this document. Here's a conveyance, and again, as you see, it's called an indenture, but it's actually a conveyance, and use of the 10 shilling George and the Dragon, paying 10 bob on transfers over £100 from memory. We also see the introduction of duty on foreign transactions. So here's, this is quite a late usage. It's into the early 20th century, but this is quite typical of a cheque that was drawn in Victoria, paid the penny Victorian stamp duty, sent to Tasmania to pay somebody in Tasmania, and then within Tasmania, a penny stamp duty was applicable as well. So in 1892, we had one final amendment, and I won't go on about that, but here's an example of a document that's been subject to an increase in duty under that amendment. And what's happened is the book of cheques has been impressed with threepenny stamp duty die, but because the rate's gone up, they've had to affix an adhesive. So it's an uprated document. I'm sure you'd all be familiar with that sort of, with that idea. Now, there are sort of still plenty of mysteries in this field, because it's sometimes hard to find the authority for any particular type of duty. And there are a number that I have in my collection. I just can't work out what the duty is all about. But I did make a discovery earlier this year. I discovered that the Court Acts also levy duty. So there was an act to recover small debts. There was a special small debts court, and within that act, there is also a requirement to pay duty on a whole lot of different types of transactions. So that explains this particular document, which has got 12 tuppenny side faces, paying $2 shillings, and can't really tell what the actual, it could be any one of a number of different types of duty, but at least I've got an authority for this now. And finally, to finish off, in 1900, foreshadowing the amalgamation of the states and the formation of the Commonwealth, with the transfer of postal responsibility to the Commonwealth, Tasmania issued a Stamp Duties Amendment Act from the 1st of December, saying that postage stamps could not be further used to pay duty. At this time, we do see the use of the Tasmanian pictorials paying stamp duty. So here's an example just before it became illegal to use Tasmanian postage stamps to pay duty. And here's an example of a document after the 1st of December 1900, and all of the duty stamps were overprinted revenue at this time until they could print further stocks, and a limited number of postage stamps were held over to be used to pay duty, but they were also overprinted revenue, notably the £1 tablet. So that really brings us up to the end of the 19th century. And at this point, I will, my presentation ends. I'll stop sharing now, and I'll just show you a couple of things before I finally finish. So thanks everybody. I hope you found that of some interest, and I'll just stop my screen sharing at this point. Okay, can you all see me?
Yep, yeah, no.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if anybody suddenly decides they must collect these things and understand them, a little ad, I've got the Courier, Tasmanian Courier 2013, and more recently last year, yeah, you probably can't see that very well, But I've written up all the acts, all the provisions from 1863 to 1900, and these are available from the TPS at the very cheap price of $10 each, if anybody's interested. So that's my free ad, and that's basically it, folks. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions? Well, we got one from Glenn Stafford. Was there any duty on land sales in Tasmania?
Well, there would have been duty on the receipts, and there would have been duty on the transfers, duty on the mortgage, duty on the payment, the cancellation of the mortgage, and any transfers of the title. So the sale itself was not taxed, but the a receipt from the vendor would be taxed, Glenn, basically. But it would only be taxed at a penny in that time. But they certainly made their money on the all the transfer documents, because that was an open-ended. The more the transfer, the more duty you would pay.
Yeah, we got another question from Zach Gringlas. He says, I understand in 1900 the 2 shilling 6pence George and Dragon were issued overprinted. Revenue. Yes. What were these used for?
A good question. They certainly were, and there were a whole bunch of 2 and 6penny rates from the 1882 Act. So they would have been used on various legal documents, and I can't from memory tell you exactly which ones. But 2 and 6, 5 shillings, 7 and 6 were standard rates from really 1870. But as I said, the 1870 rates, a lot of them were reduced to 2 and 6 in 1882. So I guess that's what they were used. We don't see any major new duties in Tassie until 1917. We see duty on receipts in 1902, but that was fairly small bickies. But in 1917, we see this sort of mysterious entertainment tax and amusements tax. The one was a Commonwealth tax and one was a Tasmanian tax. They were collected together by the Tasmanian Police Department. When I say they're mysterious, I've only ever seen about 5 of these from that period, because they were usually on theatre tickets, sporting events, and people obviously handed your ticket in. So to me, these, although this is outside the period I'm talking about, these are the rarest of the rare. So whether any of these 2 and 6 George and the Dragons were used for those, I don't know, because I've hardly ever seen any. Then in the 1920s, we start to see a lot more changes in duties and new acts.
Any more questions? Geez, must have done a good job, Peter.
Somebody
will understand it.
I'm trying to send one, Peter, but I can't send it.
You can tell me what it is.
Are these documents easy to find? Because I'm surprised that some of these are available. I would have thought that these documents would have been kept by the government departments or the banks, because, for example, they've got checks, and checks that were deposited at the bank should have been kept at the bank, and yet here they are.
Yeah. Now, that's a very interesting question. I should have said before, there were, if you look at all the duties payable under all these acts, there's dozens of them, but most of them we never see for the reasons you've mentioned. I mean, the most spectacular would be the duty on a judge's admission to the bench. You know, sort of £10 in 10 shilling George and the Dragons. But these just aren't on the market. But the checks, there was a huge haul found in the rafters or the upstairs room of one of the banks in Stanley.
Oh, is that one of those? Yeah, because they found a lot of things in the rafters at Stanley, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And now there are plenty of these on the market. But these early checks and promissory notes, such as the ones I showed from 1864, they're very rare. And how they came onto the market, I don't know. Perhaps I shouldn't say this, but I do have some understanding of how some legal documents also came onto the market. And it's not necessarily a pretty story, and I don't think I'll go into it here.
Most of the things in stamps aren't pretty stories either.
But obviously, a lot of legal documents, they would have ended up with the, you know, when your mortgage was paid out, you would have had that mortgage document cancelled with the duty on it. So a lot of them are sort of quite legitimate.
Yep.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's as much as I can say.
We've got one more question from Russell Turner. Russell says, what were the printing figures like on the 1870s, 1880s issues? Thousands or hundreds of thousands?
Yeah, somebody asked me that the other day, and I haven't got the figures. Well, for 1870, there were no duty stamps, but if you look at the 5 shilling side face, there were hundreds of thousands of those. And they're actually very common pen cancelled, but not so common postally used. And the later printings of the George and the Dragon, I don't know. I'd only be guessing. So probably best if I don't hazard a guess at that.
And Paul Peggy wants to ask you a question. Paul.
Yes, thank you. The various local roulettes and perfs, 1864, 1870.
Yep.
I've got a handful of Shellen stamps with dated stamps. Is there any documents relating to this that clarify when these printings occurred?
Oh, the Shallons?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The printings of the Shallons and the numbers are well documented. Bassett Hull, for instance. And I can't tell you off the top of my head, but there were numerous printings of the, especially the lower value Shallons. There were local London printings and local printings. So, yeah, you can, and very handy having a date on it, because that will help you to identify which printing you might be talking about.
Well, I was amazed to see fiscal documents with the serrated perforations, you know, with the actual document, the date on it that I have. So is there a lot of that around, or?
Well, it depends. I mean, some of the private perforations are incredibly scarce and very valuable, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, sort of without really knowing any more detail, that's all I can say. Some are quite common, but some of them are quite valuable. In fact, there's still some. You need to talk to Bill Lloyd-Smith. It's driving him mad. He's still asking for people to come forward with assistance with the private Shellen perforations, and the fact is, unless you can get one on cover, you know, there's still some doubt about the dates of some of those for sure.
Yep.
So have you seen much on document?
No, not really. Most of the documents I've got have got common post office perfs, to be honest.
All right.
Yeah, the George and the Dragon private perfs, they're not uncommon, especially the ones that were done by Walsh and Company down south.
Yes.
Yeah. But if you're talking about the Shallons through the 1850s and 60s, yeah, that's an interesting area for a stamp collector, which I'm not really.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm a Rhodesian collector. I've got to say to you.
Any more questions?
Can I say something?
Yes, Charles.
It's not strictly a question, but I've just been looking at the pages. We've got an auction on the weekend, and there's not a bad section, Peter, of those misshaped platypi that you were talking about with revenue overprints and things like that. But my question is, as a collector, is a mint stamp going to find its way onto one of your pages, or it's not relevant as far as the history is concerned?
No, well, the mint stamps, no, that's sort of like a a exhibiting rule question, but no, I won't be collecting mint stamps, Charles.
Okay. Fair
Only,
enough.
yeah, only used on peace or on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Understood.
Yeah.
Any more
Very,
questions?
very interesting.
Frank, this is not a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
When I was working for the Commercial Bank of Australia in the 1970-75, just after the bridge got smashed, I was on our audit staff and we did the audit of Hobart branch and a few others. But I drilled when I saw the mortgage documents there, all with the £1 St George and Dragon stamps there, for the duty. I couldn't touch them.
Well, you could have.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd probably make it invalid.
Yeah, though, and that's the thing. I mean, a lot of this stuff is probably quite common, but it's locked up.
Yes.
It's in archives and it's in the vaults of legal offices.
Mm.
And I get a lot of it's been destroyed.
Mm.
Yeah. Because, it's very sad, but I wish I worked in a bank, but I never did.
All right. Any more questions or comments? Well, if there's no more questions, I'll ask Allan Shannon to give the vote of thanks, please. Allan,
Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Hello, Pete. How are you?
Hi, Alan.
Now, I've just got to declare that there's a degree of conflict of interest in this response because Peter and I are the same height and we come from the same hometown. Yeah.
Got a beard.
And I'd like to also take the opportunity, Pete, to thank you for the assistance that you gave us in compiling the new Royal Philatelic Society of Victoria website. Pete's been there before and we use his advice extensively. It was a big help to me and I'm very grateful for it.
Thanks, Pete.
Now, the revenues that Peter have displayed, this is an absolutely genuine research project.
Mm.
The revenue stamps of Tasmania are well known, but little has been known about their usage until Pete started to explore the subject. The effort that goes into finding this material that demonstrates usage is colossal. And just to put together an exhibit like this is also a colossal amount of effort. Pete's got a great understanding of the historical context, and that applies to all of Tasmanian history, I think, from talking to Pete. But he also understands the Stamp Acts and how they were applied, or to an extent as to how they were applied. Some of the interesting things to me in the display were the perambulations across revenue and postage stamps and the different ways in which postage stamps could be used for revenue and revenue stamps could be used for postage. It's a very interesting and typically Tasmanian set of changes and things to the way they could be used. The deformed platypus is not something that I'd ever heard of before, but I can imagine it. The various methods of applying stamps of some description to revenue documents, and the opportunities for forgeries were clearly very great because you can clean the pen cancels off of a stamp, but it's very hard to get something that's been impressed with a die and use it again. So these are all things of great interest to me. Pete, I think you've done a wonderful job of this display and the research behind it. And on behalf of the Society, we thank you for presenting your exhibit and commend you for the huge amount of work that lies behind it. And we could all thank you in the usual way.
Yeah.
Need the sound on for that.
Well,
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, let me say. And it's been a pleasure. And also congratulations on the new Royal website. And Alan's done a really good job on that. And I know how much work was involved. So well done, Alan.
okay, well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Allan. I'll hand over back to John Shawley for the rest of the meeting. John.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Peter, for an excellent presentation. I got a bit worried when you described someone as being progressive because they believed in taxation, but that concerned me more than a little. But just to add to the comments of Allan, who covered it very thoroughly, I think the social history that lies behind so much of these documents is fascinating as well, and the indenturing of the young girl of 13 is a typical example of that social history. So thank you again, Peter, and thanks for the help to Allan. It's much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Now, back to the formalities. Today is a bewitching hour in a couple of respects for the club. Firstly, the entries for the annual competition were due in, and they have, at the moment, unless there's any surprises, they are a total of 10. I've just read the annual report of last year, and they were congratulating, or Ted Gallagher was congratulating the club on reaching 7. This year we've reached 10, and that's a very good result. It's only rather sad that the circumstances that have got us all focusing on things like single frame entries, but it's wonderful to have 10. Bill Clark, our secretary, tells me that he has all 10. They're all now in PDFs and on their way to the judges in the mail either today or tomorrow. So thank you, Bill, for doing that work. The other bewitching hour is nominations for council. Unless there's some surprises, all of those had been in with Bill some time ago. And of course, that will come up and will be discussed at the AGM. Now, that's my next subject for discussion, is the AGM on the 17th of September. What we're going to do, because that 17th of September is very close to the end of the Victorian lockdown. And as a consequence, we don't know what sort of world we'll be living in, but one can only be a little bit pessimistic about that world.
Oh, God.
The plan is at the moment that we will do that as another Zoom session. And I think under Frank's great management, we're off to a very good start. And I don't know how many people we've actually got online. It was in the 30s when I last.
38.
38. That's a great result. And
That's a great result.
Frank, thank you for managing and stage managing the whole thing. But we plan on doing it. But the key thing for us is to have 20. Within our rules, it's quite legitimate for us to do this as a Zoom meeting, but we need 20 people. The plan is that Frank will send out an all points bulletin, just drawing people's attention and asking people who intend to attend to tell Bill Clark. Bill will then send them the link to use to join up. So could I ask as many people as possible? 20 is a minimum. It certainly is not a maximum, and as many people as can get there will be entirely welcome. So please, as many of you as can, please sign up to attend that meeting. That will only be the AGM. There had been a thought that we might combine that with the showing of the annual competition, but with 10 and therefore 160 sheets, that's hardly going to be manageable. So we're just going to have an AGM. So it'll be reasonably short and sweet. The plans then for actually when we do show the annual competition, which by the way will be going onto the website. Allan has that in hand, and I'm hoping that will be achievable. That's what I think I can hear a voice saying it will be. So that's good news. They'll be online, but they will be online at the timing of the 17th of September meeting when the judges have assessed them. And thank you, Charles and Allan Gray, for your work on doing that assessment. They say it's on its way to you, but it will show what the awards are on the website. So you'll be able to see all of the actual entries. Therefore, how we actually go about running a meeting on that and the date of that is yet to be planned, but it's most likely to be another Zoom session. So those are the things looking ahead. The website has been touched on a couple of times. Can I just emphasize it is a phenomenally improved website. Please go onto it. We keep on expanding it. Well thought through comments about it are welcome, because we know it's going to be a dynamic. We want to keep developing it. It's not going to be a static. So please think about ways you believe it can be improved. So that's all I would say on that. The Philatelic from Australia is due very soon. Eric Fraser hopes to be getting that from the printer in the middle of next week. and I'm arranging to get envelopes to him at the beginning of the week. We both live, fortunately, in overlapping 5-kilometre radii, so somewhere in Paran we can meet and be legal. So we'll be handing those over. We're doing some shopping at the work as well, by the way, just in case anyone. But the Philatelic from Australia will be available very, very soon. I think that's about all that I've got. I've thanked Frank when it's been an excellent one. I'd normally invite you for tea and biscuits, and that would be part of the pro forma. I suggest we all go away and have a glass of wine or whatever suits our palate, and I would just say thank you all for your attendance. Now, are there any other matters coming from the floor? So, Frank, if you can manage this for us in case anyone wants to add anything.
Can I raise one matter, please?
Fire away.
Yep. Yes, sure.
Yeah. The next thing we're working on in the website is exhibits. If anybody has an exhibit that they'd like or they think is worth displaying on the website, could they let me know?
That will be excellent. The more variety we can get on there, the better. And so that's the plan, is to have a wide range, and we hope to attract people onto our website. What we don't hope to do is attract them to ask us for valuations and the like, and I'm following that up with Frank in the near future. There's a page there, Frank, that says contacts, how to contact us, and that's now going to have an addition saying do not contact us for the following.
Oh, good.
That would be the plan. But anything else from the floor?
I'd just like to make a comment that, hey, we've got 38 people who are listening to us. We don't get that in a normal meeting, and it's great to be able to broaden the appeal of the Royal for interstate and overseas members who would never normally have access to talking to all of these people, now have access now. I think it's fantastic. I think it's been a really good job by yourself, John, and especially Frank. And we had a great exhibit, so I think it's a job well done for everybody.
Seconded, maybe
Can I just go on
make this an annual event.
Well, that an annual event, or should we do it more frequently to be able to draw in people from around the world as our members?
Yes.
That's something we can talk about, because I think it's very worthwhile. We don't even get half this many at some of our meetings.
Exactly.
Especially in winter.
Yeah.
And on the 5th. On the 5th.
And we can even get Colin Hoffman to do a presentation sometime.
He's
Well, he heard me.
I couldn't quite hear it. Okay, in that case, sorry, somebody else coming in?
No, that's fine.
Okay, well, thank you all, for all 38 of us, for getting together in this novel way. I deem it to be a great success. So well done, Frank, in particular for your role. But thank you all for attending. It's been a very good evening. Thank you again, and goodbye, good night or good morning to those in the UK.
Thank you all, and good